I grew up in western Nebraska, where the land is as flat as a sheet of glass and the sky stretches so wide it feels like you might fall off the edge of the earth. My family owned a modest cattle farm, nothing too big, just a couple hundred acres and a few dozen head of cattle. My dad and my uncle ran the place together, and from the time I could walk, I was expected to help out. It was hard work, long days under the sun, and freezing mornings in the dead of winter, but it was home. The farm had been in our family for 3 generations, and I always thought it would stay that way. That was before the summer of 2010, before things started happening, things I still can't explain. It started small. Cattle going missing. That wasn't unheard of. Coyotes, rustlers, even the occasional mountain lion. But the way they were disappearing didn't make sense. We'd find their tracks leading out into the pastures, then suddenly stopping like they'd been lifted straight off the ground. No blood, no struggle, just gone. Then came the noises. At night, when everything was supposed to be still, we'd hear something moving out past the fence line. Slow, heavy footsteps, too big to be a coyote, but too deliberate to be cattle. Sometimes it sounded like breathing, deep, ragged, almost wheezing. I remember lying in bed, the window cracked open to let in the cool night air, and hearing it just beyond the trees. My dad told me not to worry. Just the wind, he'd say, even when there wasn't a single breeze in the air. Then, one night, I saw something. It was late, past midnight, and I couldn't sleep. I'd been lying there for hours, staring at the ceiling, listening to the occasional creak of the old house settling. That's when I heard it again. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, just beyond the barn. I don't know what made me do it, but I got up, crept to my window, and looked outside. The moon was bright, casting long shadows across the fields. At first, I didn't see anything, just the barn, the fence, and the dark outline of the trees beyond. Then something moved. At first, I thought it was a man, tall, thin, standing just outside the barn. But the longer I looked, the more I realized something was wrong. Its arms were too long, hanging past its knees. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle, like it was listening for something. And then, as if it could hear my thoughts, it turned its head. I don't know how to describe the feeling that washed over me. It wasn't just fear. It was like every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to hide, to pretend I hadn't seen it, but I couldn't move. It stared at me for what felt like forever, then took a single step toward the house. I slammed the window shut and dove under my covers like a damn kid, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't sleep at all that night. The next morning, I went out to the barn, half convinced I'd imagined the whole thing. But something had been there. The barn door was wide open, swinging on its hinges. Deep grooves were carved into the wooden beams, like something had raked its fingers across them. I told my dad, but he just gave me that same tired look. "You've been working too hard," he said. "Get some rest." But that night, it came back. This time, it wasn't just outside the barn. It was closer. I woke up to the sound of the porch creaking, slow, rhythmic, like someone stepping carefully across the old wooden boards. I held my breath, my ears straining. Then came the knocking. Soft at first, just a gentle tap, tap, tap against the front door. Then harder. I couldn't move. I couldn't even blink. The knocking stopped. And then, from just outside my bedroom window, I heard something whisper my name. I don't remember what happened after that. I must have passed out from fear because the next thing I knew, the sun was shining, and my dad was shaking me awake. He was pale, his mouth set in a tight line. "We need to talk," he said. He led me outside, and that's when I saw it. The front door, the thick, heavy oak door that had been there since my grandfather built the house, was covered in scratches. Not just random marks, but deep, deliberate carvings. My name, over and over again. We didn't talk about it. Not really. My dad reinforced the doors and windows, added extra locks, but we both knew it wouldn't make a difference. A week later, my uncle packed up and left. "I've seen enough," was all he said before he drove off. Things got worse after that. The cattle kept disappearing. The noises outside the house grew more frequent. I stopped sleeping entirely, lying awake every night, listening, waiting. Then, one night, it finally got inside. I woke up to the sound of something moving down the hall. Slow, dragging footsteps, like something with long limbs trying to move through a space too small for it. I reached for the baseball bat I kept under my bed, my fingers slick with sweat. The footsteps stopped, right outside my door. For a long time, there was nothing, just silence. Then, the doorknob began to turn. I don't know what possessed me, but I shot out of bed, grabbed the bat, and yanked the door open. Nothing. The hallway was empty, but the front door was wide open, swinging in the breeze. We left the farm 2 days later, packed everything we could fit into the truck, and never looked back. My dad never talked about why, but I think he saw it too. Maybe not that night, but at some point. I still dream about it. The long arms, the way it tilted its head like it was listening. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet, I swear I can still hear it whisper my name. I used to work as a farmhand in southern Missouri, just outside a town so small you'd miss it if you blinked. It wasn't the life I wanted, but after dropping out of college and running low on cash, I needed something steady. The job came with a trailer to live in, and I didn't have to pay rent, so I figured I'd tough it out for a year or two. The farm was massive, hundreds of acres of soybean and cornfields, with a few barns scattered around. The guy who owned it, Mr. Conroy, was an old-school farmer, the kind who expected you to be up before dawn and working until the sun dipped behind the fields. The place had a history, though. People in town didn't like talking about it much, but whenever I went into the local diner for coffee, I'd catch bits and pieces of conversations, stories about the land, about things that happened long before Conroy bought it. The older folks, the ones who had been around long enough to remember, would shake their heads and mutter about bad soil and things that ought to stay buried. I didn't pay much attention to it at first. Every small town has its ghost stories, right? I started noticing the sounds about 3 weeks into the job. It always happened late at night, long after I'd finished work for the day. At first, it was just a distant rustling, like wind moving through the corn, but there was never any wind when it happened. The nights were dead still, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. Sometimes, I'd hear a faint clicking noise, like something tapping against wood. Other times, it was low, almost like a growl, but too deep and unnatural to be any animal I knew. One night, I was out by the main barn, finishing up late. Mr. Conroy had asked me to double-check the fencing on the east side of the property after one of the cows had gotten loose. I had my flashlight, but the batteries were running low, and the beam kept flickering. As I walked along the fence line, I heard it again, that tapping sound, rhythmic, deliberate. It was coming from the cornfield about 30 yards away. I stood there for a second, listening, telling myself it was probably just a raccoon or some other critter. But then the sound changed. It wasn't just tapping anymore. It was footsteps, slow, heavy, moving closer. I pointed my flashlight toward the noise, but the light barely cut through the darkness. The rows of corn swayed slightly, even though the air was perfectly still. Then, just as I was about to turn away, I saw something shift between the stalks. A shape, taller than any person should be, with long, thin limbs that didn't move quite right. I ran. I didn't stop until I was back in my trailer, locking the door behind me. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely breathe. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the darkness had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. The next morning, I told Mr. Conroy about it, expecting him to laugh it off. Instead, he got real quiet. He stared at me for a long moment, then said, "You stay out of those fields at night. You hear me?" That was it. No explanation, no reassurance. Just a warning. I should have listened. A few nights later, I woke up to a noise outside my trailer. It was that same clicking sound, closer this time, right outside my window. My stomach dropped. I reached for the flashlight on my nightstand and turned it on, but I didn't pull back the curtain. I didn't want to see what was out there. The tapping started on the glass. Light at first, then harder. Deliberate. I sat there, frozen, gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles ached. The tapping stopped. Then, slowly, the doorknob rattled. I don't know what came over me, but I shot out of bed, grabbed my shotgun from the closet, and swung the door open. The porch light flickered, casting weak shadows across the dirt. Nothing. The field stretched out in front of me, silent and unmoving. But I knew something had been there. Watching. Waiting. I barely slept after that. Every night, I'd hear the sounds. Footsteps in the fields. Tapping at my window. Low, guttural breathing just beyond the trailer walls. It got to the point where I started keeping the shotgun next to my bed, loaded and ready. Then came the night I saw it. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard the footsteps again. This time, they didn't stop at my window. They circled the trailer, slow and methodical. My chest felt tight, like I couldn't get enough air. I grabbed my gun and crept toward the door, swallowing down the terror rising in my throat. And then, the porch light flickered again. For just a second, the weak yellow glow caught something standing at the edge of the cornfield. It wasn't human. Its body was elongated, stretched too thin, its limbs bending at unnatural angles. The head was wrong, too narrow, almost skeletal, with hollow, black eyes that seemed to swallow the light. It stood there, motionless, staring at me. I don't remember pulling the trigger, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, the shotgun blast echoed through the night. When I looked again, the thing was gone. The corn swayed slightly, as if something had just moved through it, but the air was still. The next morning, I packed my bags. I told Mr. Conroy I was leaving, that I couldn't stay another night on that farm. He didn't try to stop me. He just nodded and said, "Figured you might." As I was throwing my stuff in my truck, he walked over and handed me an envelope. "For your trouble," he said. I didn't open it until I was miles away. Inside was a stack of cash and a small, folded note. It read, "You should have never looked." I grew up in a small town in Kansas, on a farm that had been in my family for generations. My dad ran the place with the kind of quiet determination you only find in men who have spent their entire lives working the land. My mom helped where she could, but most of her time was spent making sure my little brother Danny and I didn't get into too much trouble. Our farm stretched for miles, mostly cornfields that seemed to go on forever. During the summers, the stalks would grow so tall that once you stepped a few feet inside, it was like being in another world. My brother and I spent our childhood playing in those fields, hiding from each other, making up stories about the strange things we imagined lived in the shadows between the rows. But some stories, it turns out, don't need to be made up. It started with the footprints. One morning, Dad called us out to the edge of the property, where a section of the corn had been trampled down in a straight line, like someone had walked directly through it in the night. That wasn't the weird part, though. The weird part was that the prints were barefoot. Danny and I stood there, staring at the imprints in the dirt. They were deep, like whoever made them was heavy, but the shape was wrong. The toes were too long, and the arch of the foot was too high. It almost looked like a person's footprint, but stretched, distorted, wrong. Dad wasn't the kind of man to get spooked easily, but I remember the way he frowned as he crouched down, touching the dirt like he was trying to make sense of it. "Might be some drifter passing through," he muttered. "You boys keep an eye out, all right?" Danny and I nodded, but there was something in Dad's voice that made me uneasy. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about those footprints, picturing them in my mind over and over again. At some point, exhaustion took over, and I must have dozed off. But I woke up just a few hours later to the sound of something moving outside my window. At first, I thought it was the wind. The fields would rustle whenever the breeze picked up, and it wasn't uncommon for an animal to wander too close to the house. But this was different. It was slow, deliberate, like footsteps. I held my breath, straining to listen. Danny was snoring in the bed across from me, completely unaware. I turned my head toward the window, careful not to make any noise. The moonlight cast long shadows over the yard, making everything look stretched and unfamiliar. And then I saw it. A shape, just beyond the fence line, standing at the very edge of the corn. It was tall, too tall. Its arms hung low, unnaturally long, almost reaching its knees. The moonlight caught its face just enough for me to see that it wasn't a face at all. Just a blank, pale shape where features should have been. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Then it tilted its head. I don't know why, but that was the thing that broke me. The movement was too smooth, too precise. like it was mimicking something it had seen before. I squeezed my eyes shut, pulling the blanket over my head like a little kid, heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I must have stayed like that for hours because the next thing I remember was the sound of my dad's truck starting outside. The sun was up, casting golden light over the fields. Everything looked normal, safe, but I knew what I had seen. For the next few days, I did everything I could to push the memory away, convincing myself that I had imagined it. A trick of the light. A half-dream. But then Danny saw it too. It was just after sundown when he came running into the house, breathless, eyes wild with panic. "There's something in the corn," he gasped. Mom and Dad exchanged a glance before Dad grabbed his rifle from the cabinet. "Stay here," he ordered. But Danny grabbed his arm, shaking his head violently. "You don't understand," he whispered. "It's not normal." Dad took Danny and me outside, his flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. "Show me," he said. Danny led us to the far side of the field, where the stalks had been pushed back in a wide circle. Not trampled, not cut, bent. In the center of that circle was a dead deer. Its body was untouched. No blood, no wounds, just wrong. Its neck was twisted at an impossible angle, and its eyes were gone, just empty sockets staring into nothing. Dad swore under his breath. I could see it in his face. He didn't know what to make of this. None of us did. That night, Dad stayed up with his rifle, pacing the front porch. Danny and I slept in the living room with Mom, though neither of us really slept. Every creak, every gust of wind, every distant rustle in the fields made my skin crawl. Then, just before dawn, we heard it. Whistling. It came from the corn. Low, slow, almost playful. Dad bolted to his feet, rifle raised. But before he could do anything, the whistling moved, first to the left, then to the right, circling the house. Something was out there. Something that knew we were here. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The sun rose, bathing the fields in golden light, and everything was still again. But we weren't fooled. We knew it was still out there, hiding, waiting. That was the last night we stayed on the farm. Dad never gave us a full explanation, but within a week, he had packed up everything we owned and moved us to a rental house in town. He sold the farm a few months later to some out-of-state developer. Last I heard, they plowed over the cornfields and built a bunch of houses. I wonder if the new owners ever hear whistling at night. I wonder if it's still out there, watching? Thank you for watching. Comments help to grow my channel.